All right. So when I first started doing this work back in September, I had a dream that instead of this work, I was doing a performance piece. And the performance piece involved me being locked inside a crate in a gallery. And in this dream, the gallery assistant locked me in the crate, and I could see her walking away through the cracks between the slats in the crate. And I suddenly started to wonder if I had actually made any agreement with anyone to let me out of the crate. And I woke up wondering if I had the strength to take on work that has this dark nature. But of course, it didn't take me long after I woke up to realize that if the work scared me that much, it was probably a reason to turn towards it instead of away from it. So I really thought I was up for the challenge, and I'm glad that I did take it on. So it's hard to say where exactly this work began, but just for the sake of choosing a starting point, I'll say that it began with a question, or several questions. One of those questions was about identity and how historical narratives shape our identity. So, for example, how is the identity different for someone who has been told all their life that they're the descendant of people who were considered subhuman and were basically enslaved because they lacked the means and the technology to defend themselves? So how is that identity different from someone who's grown up being told that their ancestors invented everything that is considered good about humanity, philosophy, literature, the parliamentary system, law, all of those things that we've been told since kindergarten really are the greatest achievements of humanity? And so not just how is that identity different, which I would define as identity as the way that the world sees us or the way that we think the world sees us. So not just our identities, but how does it affect the way we actually move through the world and how we interact with people and the choices that we make in our lives. And I think all of those things are affected by these historical narratives. So that was one question. Then I also started to ask, why is this narrative of slavery the narrative that we as people of African descent living in the Americas, why is that the story that we keep returning to again and again to explain who we are and why we're here? And of course it is why we're here. But I also started to question why we wear that identity so proudly as this being our greatest achievement of having overcome this oppression and thrived in a way despite this history. So I do think of identity as something we wear. Certain aspects of it are things that we choose to wear, and other aspects are not. So the deeper I went into this work, the more, of course, I started to question, well, is this really an identity that we're choosing to wear? Or is it something that's placed upon us? And so by creating these objects of adornment, which are also restraints, but if you look closely, you'll see all of them can easily be taken off once they're worn. I actually started to realize that I was probably making this work because I was imagining the relief that I would feel in actually taking off this identity, to remove the burden that history has placed upon us. While I was making these pieces, I was also rereading one of the best novels I've read about slavery. It's called The Known World, and it had a huge impact on me, this novel. It's by Edward P. Jones. And the passages that I found the most heartbreaking in this novel were not scenes of whipping and torture like you would see in a Hollywood movie, but the most heartbreaking passages were actually moments, small moments of beauty and love and kindness and small moments of dignity that people found in their otherwise miserable lives. So I think that some of that is at play in this work as well. It's the idea of somehow making something of the most dire circumstances and trying to find moments of beauty in it and humanity in it. There is a wonderful quote that I came across by Ralph Ellison, and he's writing about music, but it could easily be applied to this work, and it could easily, when we think about it, be applied to his own novels as well. So I'll share it with you. So he wrote, "The blues is an impulse to keep the painful details and episodes of a brutal experience alive in one's aching consciousness, to finger its jagged grain and to transcend it, not by the consolation of philosophy, but by squeezing from it a near tragic, near comic lyricism. As a form, the blues is an autobiographical chronicle of personal catastrophe expressed lyrically." So we could talk about keeping the brutal experience of slavery alive in the collective consciousness, but on a much deeper, more personal level, this work is also about the pain of being other in childhood. And although I grew up in a loving family in a middle-class neighborhood surrounded by the beauty of nature, and I've never been a victim of oppression or poverty or violence, there was a subtle kind of racism that seeped into that liberal enclave of Vancouver where I grew up. And although this racism was subtle, it was painful and impactful nonetheless. And that pain is something that I buried deep within me in childhood and have been carrying with me throughout my life. And although I found less painful ways to carry that otherness into adulthood, that pain was somewhere still inside me. And a few years ago, I discovered that it was still there, and I thought there would be some value in bringing it out to the surface and actually displaying it and dealing with it instead of hiding it. All right, so that is what I have to say about the work. But I also would like to talk a little bit about the format of this talk. You may notice that I'm having it filmed. And it may seem like vanity to get all dressed up and film my artist talk, but this talk is actually much more important to me than my written thesis. And that is partly because I think that by filming it, and if I decide to put it online, it will reach many more people and more people from different walks of life than it would as a paper copy that is stored in the NASCAD library. And the other more ideological reason that this is important to me is I actually heard an academic on CBC recently quoting Marshall McLuhan and saying that in the computer age, we're actually returning to being an oral culture. And this really struck a chord with me because at the time I had been learning about African American and African oral traditions and how those really aren't as respected as the literature and philosophy that has come out of Europe over several hundred years. And thinking about how the cultures that had the written word for hundreds of years used it to assert their supremacy over the cultures that didn't have it. And I realized only recently how deeply I actually believed in the supremacy of European ideas and thought. And it was quite shocking and disturbing to me to discover this, to discover that I believed in this. But at the same time, we shouldn't be shocked to discover this, because really we have been taught from a very early age that European thought and ideas are really the highest achievement of all human cultures. And I think in a time when we are able, through technology, to embrace becoming an oral culture again, we can start to see that the written word is really just one way to record and express our thoughts and feelings and pass them on to other people. And now that we have access to all of these different ways, we can start to use those methods of communication with enthusiasm and sample the many varieties of passing on our ideas. And I actually think it's fitting that this is happening at the same time when people are actually starting to talk about, or at least starting to think about, embracing non-Eurocentric worldviews. And I see no reason why we shouldn't be able to embrace the ideas of, for example, the Mi'kmaq, whose ancestral lands and unceded territories we are all squatting on right now, and why those views can't be discussed in just the same conversations in which we discuss European ideas and also African ideas or ideas of indigenous people around the world or Asian philosophies, why we shouldn't discuss all of these things. And we might even be able to hope that at some point no single worldview will be placed above any of the others as the goal of human achievement. So after I finished the last piece for this show, I had another powerful dream. And sometimes when I can't sleep at night, I listen to podcasts. And I fell asleep listening to an interview with the Norwegian actress and director Liv Ullmann. And some of her words seem to have made it into my dream. So in my dream, Liv Ullmann was standing in a field in the sunshine near a split rail fence. And she was speaking to me, and she was saying in her beautiful lilting accent that we arrive on this earth not knowing what our mission is. And part of our journey through life is to discover what those important things are that we are to do in our lives, the things that will make our lives important. And as she was speaking, I noticed there were two beautiful white owls sitting on the fence behind her. And they were stretching out their wings and stretching their chests towards me as though they wanted me to stroke their white feathers. And there was a wolf lying on the ground near her as well. And it also was looking up at me as though it wanted me to stroke its fur. And although I didn't touch these animals in the dream, I could sense the warm softness of their fur and their feathers. And when I woke up, I knew that the period of darkness that I had to pass through to make this work was over. And I also knew that this was part of the mission, that one of the things that I had to do in life that made my life important. Thank you. Okay, so we do have time for some questions. Because we're videotaping this, if you prefer for your question not to be public on the video, just say so before you ask your question, and we can cut it out in the editing. And then I would also like to leave some time at the end for more casual conversation. So what time is it now? 20 after? Okay, so we'll say maybe 15 or 20 minutes for the group discussion, and then we'll put away the chairs, and then anyone who doesn't feel comfortable asking questions or making comments in this format, we can discuss it in a more casual way. So does anyone have any questions? And you can ask me stuff about even just like how the work is made or my experience or anything. You're welcome to ask me anything. Yes? So the panels and the way I chose to display them. So it was a combination of practical concerns and aesthetic choices and obvious symbolic choices as well. It's always difficult. One of the challenges that I wanted to take on with this work was how to display jewelry in a contemporary art gallery, because often galleries don't have the right displays or cases for jewelry. So I knew I had to find a way to mount them and actually make them accessible for a contemporary art gallery. And yeah, it's actually hard to say how I decided exactly on these pieces. But I also would like to turn the question around and ask what people think is the impact of putting them on these black backgrounds. Does anyone want to comment on that?
I found them a little bit more difficult to see because of the dark, dark feel behind it.
Right.
The metal itself is patina, a little bit dark, some are light. But the dark panels are so intriguing that it basically entices me to get closer. And then I'm rewarded by seeing much more as I get closer. But I also had a comment. I think the merit of achieving survival of oppression should never be diminished. And I think your work celebrates that and is a really excellent hallmark to that principle.
Thank you.
I really do like to see much more of this kind of manifestation of that aesthetic to be produced. So congratulations on that. I think a very successful body of work.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think the angles of the pieces make me envision them being worn. Like I'm not, like I don't really think of the black rectangles as facing a person, but it just seems the angle, everything, and I'm short, so it's about, like I can imagine being in them, just for looking at someone my size.
Yeah, and that was deliberate. I did hang them at what is mostly neck height to my height as well, so that people could imagine themselves in them.
I think symbolically the black background is very fitting and striking. And just the idea that it's black and it's a background implies like a dark history, and I think that's obviously self-explanatory in the work, but I think that it just goes very well together, and it was a good decision.
Thank you. Yeah. And then I think also to me, they also symbolize an absence. So whether that's the absence of Black bodies in Western art history, or there's so many different things that it could also symbolize. And the anonymity of people during slavery as well. Yeah.
Have you worn them much, or have other people worn them much?
No.
Photography or anything?
No, I've only worn them to like actually, because I wanted them to be completely wearable, and I wanted to give the impression that they would look right on the body, but no, I wouldn't wear them, and I wouldn't want other people to wear them as well. I feel like they're a bit too heavy to actually be placing on the human body.
Yeah, because they seem quite frightening even to touch. Like I can't hardly imagine handling them.
Yeah. Yeah, and there were actually times during the making of the pieces where I actually had to leave the studio because they were scaring me. So yeah, it was difficult in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Karin, along that line, what do you see their future being?
Well, I definitely hope to show them in more galleries across Canada. So yeah, basically I guess for all of us, what we hope that our art would do is to travel to other communities and start conversations, and for other people to see them.
Now that you're on this side of the dream, do you still feel like that power, or that fear, or what was it that the emotion may cause you to feel to leave the studio?
They actually, it was almost like a voodoo feeling. Like it was scary. It just really pushed me away. And and now that they're done and I've lived with them, most of them, or several of them, were hanging on my studio wall for the last few months. And now that I've lived with them for a while, they don't scare me as much. So I am more comfortable with them now. Yeah. Evelyn?
Could you talk a little bit about your upbringing and if there were people of color around you and where you got comfort?
Yeah, right, yeah. It was a mostly white neighborhood that I grew up in suburban Vancouver. And there were a handful of other Black kids, although most of us were mixed in that community. And I had some other friends that were mixed like me, but I was never really that close with them. It was great because I have a twin sister, and she and I went through a lot of the same things at the same time. And and my parents, who are here today, also were really great about teaching us things that we did have to be proud of, and teaching us about our history. And it was a very supportive environment. But it was mostly the things that I talked about. The racism that came in was mostly about the history, and it really was somehow presented to me in early childhood, not by my parents, but by the community around me, that being African is really one of the lowest things that you can be. That was the message that we got somehow in childhood. So that is something that, like, how do you deal with that as a child, right? So, yeah.
The sense of people is really strong, and you were talking about this in the work. And I was wondering if you could talk about the iconography of what you might call the embellishment on different pieces, because some of it feels so violent, like the sense of a person ripped in some way, and others almost feel like an embellishment that might have been done as a means of making a horrible situation a little better.
Yeah, I think all of them are adorned in a way, like all of them have elements that are trying to make them beautiful. Yeah, it's hard to say. It's just somehow, and again, it's not at all a rational thing. So obviously I was making some rational decisions while I was doing this, but I also was actually just really gathering the materials in my studio and putting them together in certain ways and feeling the impact of how they looked together and the emotional impact of seeing them together. Yeah.
Karin, most of the African sculpture that I've seen employs cowrie shells,
Mm-hmm.
and you have substituted, maybe that's the wrong word,
Mm-hmm.
hominy or corn.
Mhm.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the symbolic nature of the corn.
Yeah, so the corn, it actually came to me as a more personal story for why I wanted to use the original piece is that first piece over there, which uses just the usual kind of dried corn that we see. And then somehow I had an image in my mind of larger corn kernels. I don't know where I had seen them before, but somehow I was looking for that. And then I actually did come across a bag of this hominy in a Portuguese grocery store in Vancouver. And yeah, and I do actually love that it does look kind of like cowrie shells. And obviously there's the connection with that it's a food that has been used a lot in the South. It would have been a staple on plantations. But yeah, that is definitely an association I was aware of. Like if you came from Africa and there were no cowrie shells available to you and that's what you were used to making your art with, I do imagine that you would be looking for other materials to recreate that sort of feeling. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I just want to first congratulate you on such a powerful exhibition.
Thank you.
And I was going to comment about material-wise. I found a lot of the sort of, to me, the corn almost suggest teeth.
Mm-hmm.
And the hair, of course, is very suggestive of a trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess it's more of a comment that it's a kind of processing of intergenerational trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if that's something you've looked into at all, intergenerational trauma.
No, not really, not specifically. I haven't researched it. Like, I mean, I feel for sure in myself that it is in me. And I have even had inklings of very mysterious ancestral kind of memories, physical ancestral memories that have come through. But I haven't actually read about how that happens scientifically or psychologically. Mm-hmm.
I think it's really interesting how you want to hang this on these boards that don't have mirrors or anything, and just to put it here,
Mm-hmm.
and the sense of dread of putting it on somebody.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like such a metaphor for what you're talking about earlier about the dichotomy of the relationship with African North American people and slavery,
Mm-hmm.
and talking about how there's a courage and a strength we all see in it, but it is such a heavy yoke to carry.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see yourself? I hate to ask what you're going to do next or anything.
Yeah.
It's the worst question to ask, you know, but do you see yourself moving your art towards a different way, a different theme? Like, do you feel like focusing on slavery is too much for you to do, or something you want to move past, or do you think there's still a worth in continuing to explore? I feel on a certain level that this work is complete. So yeah, so it's hard for me to say. I don't know, actually. I don't intend to keep making work about slavery. I'm basically just gonna wait for the next thing that catches my attention and wants me to make it. So yeah, so we'll have to see. It's hard to say at this moment. Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
It's been 50 years since the death of Martin Luther King Jr.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering how you felt about those 50 there's still much more work needed to be done.
Mm-hmm.
But is society moving in general towards a resolution of some of these problems and moving towards the principles that we espouse?
Yeah, I mean, definitely things have gotten better, but obviously they're not perfect. And I actually don't know if they ever will be perfect, right? Like, it just seems to me like the more I hear about different societies, it almost seems like every society has another or a persecuted minority living within it. And I think it's always going to be uncomfortable for those people. And I think as long as we make sure that people are, that their human rights are observed and that we try and minimize the damage to those minorities, I think that's what we should be moving towards. But I have no illusion that it'll ever be completely comfortable to be a minority living within the dominant majority. Mm-hmm. All right, so thanks for coming. We can put away the chairs, and I'm going to be here for a while longer, so if anyone wants to ask me questions more personally or make comments or mingle in the gallery and look at the work a little bit more, please do feel welcome to. And we will also be next Wednesday evening at 6 o'clock in Graduate Forum. We'll be having another group discussion about the work here in the gallery. So you're also welcome to show up. If anything comes up, if any questions come up over the next little while, you can come there, or you can even just feel free to stop me in the hall and if you see me walking around, and I'm always happy to talk about this work. One more question?
Could you please introduce your parents?
Yes, okay, sorry. Barbara and David Jones are sitting right here, so yeah. And I know Benjamin didn't want me to acknowledge him for donating some dreads, and Evelyn here as well. Evelyn White also donated some dreads, so I did want to thank you publicly for that. Yeah. Thank you. Good.